I was, in a sense, compelled to start writing about music because of the difficulties or the stresses, strains, and obstacles that I saw young musicians facing as a producer. When I started producing groups, making records with younger people, that's when I started to encounter like these questions that needed to be researched, they needed to be discussed. And so I ended up writing The Trouble with Music more or less as a byproduct of having been a producer and working with a lot of young musicians who, they came expecting me to be able to make a hit or make them successful or something like that without having any kind of understanding of how the music industry works or what's really involved in the process of making music. They knew how to play, they had some ideas about what they wanted to say through their music, but they were very confused about like what the actual goal was. Is the goal to be rich and famous? Or is the goal to make beautiful music? Is the goal to express yourself? Is the goal to change the world? What is the goal? For a very large part of the world and for a very long period of time, musicians were actually slaves. In other words, the people who made music in the courts of India, Iran, places, Persia and whatnot, in many cases were slaves. They were just outright slaves, and they were trained to make music for the courtiers. By the time you get to the Middle Ages in Europe, they weren't slaves, they were hired by the church largely and by aristocrats to make music. And some of our most cherished musicians who produce some of the greatest music of all time were essentially just hired servants. Johann Sebastian Bach, for example. I mean, they just made their living churning out what was required of them by their employers, which was, and he's a notorious case because in his own writings, constant complaints about how he's being treated by his employers, And I think that to the extent that music even was viewed as like something, devilish and something actually demonic, you have what I quoted in my book, that in certain Islamic law, a musician was considered outside the law, that they could not give testimony in a court case, that if a musician was brought before a court, they were almost automatically considered guilty. And that, as you might say, has parallels in the 20th century and even today, where musicians were viewed to a large extent as somehow uncanny. That there was something about musicians. It wasn't just that they took drugs or were inebriated, and it wasn't just that they were irresponsible and maybe couldn't be trusted. There was something about the fact that they could produce these wonderful sounds that got people excited and got people stirred up, that made them untrustworthy. And so, if you grew up in a musical family, that's one thing. You might be encouraged by your parents or your grandparents, but a lot of people that I grew up with, when they wanted to take up music because of the Beatles or because of what was happening in the 60s, their parents were dead set against it. There's no future in that. You get a real job, man. And besides, you're going to end up destroying your life. So there was always this. There has been this bad odor associated with being a musician for a very long time. With classical musicians, it's a bit different because you have, in many cases, a college education is involved, a lot of training, and for a lot of classical musicians, I won't say even the majority, but a certain number, there is real income. If you're in an orchestra or whatever, you can make a steady living. So there's a certain kind of respectability associated. But for a lot of other musicians, including jazz musicians and certainly hip hop artists and whatever, there is definitely a sense of like danger, being out beyond the pale of respectability. The whole image of success, or what an artist should aspire to do, has certainly changed, along with the overall message that certainly has been promoted by the tech industry, Silicon Valley, that success can be measured in terms of money, millions, billions of dollars, measured in terms of property, the lifestyles of the rich and famous, things like that. Some of which is blatantly absurd and actually rather silly on a certain level. But on the other hand, it functions particularly amongst the demographic that aspires to be musicians, and which to a large extent comes from lower classes of people, as a matter of fact. Certainly there are people in the middle class, upper middle class, whatever, who aspire to be musicians as well, but music tends to bring forward uneducated people out of the ghetto or whatever, because they see a chance of getting out of their let's say difficult economic situation through music. That's for a long time been music and sports are a ways out of poverty for a lot of people. I wouldn't say it's particularly new that you would have these images being purveyed to young people, like with hip hop or rock and roll or whatever. But now they have become, you might say, they become so dominant there isn't that much alternative to it. Whereas there was during even the 80s, there was still a certain, you might say a rebellious, maybe it's the backwash of the 60s, of the revolutionary 60s, that there was another generation born in the 60s that grew up with that kind of attitude, certainly with punk rock and a variety of other popular forms, including the original hip hop, a lot of which was quite conscious and quite political and was very definitely aimed at the system. Certainly artists like Public Enemy were, and they were really, really popular at one point. And there has been a concerted effort, undoubtedly, to convince artists that, there, as Margaret Thatcher said, there is no alternative. Tina, this is it. The end of history. We've reached this place where you basically have to get on the bus and join in the system, or you're nowhere. You're nothing. You don't even exist. And the price that music in particular has paid for that is quite tangible. In other words, it's not just an abstract theoretical notion in some academic debate about capitalism or neoliberalism or something like that. This has tangible results in terms of where funding goes, where does money get spent in terms of education, in terms of the actual encouragement of people to engage in things that do not produce a profit. There's an awful lot of human endeavor that is simply joyous, that simply produces beauty for its own sake, for the sake of enlightening and making life worth living. And this doesn't produce a profit. This does not make money. Even though most people would welcome those kinds of feelings and those experiences in their lives, they're being constantly hammered with advertising and with other subliminal messages or whatever that encourage them to be consumers and to participate in this, what I consider to be a rather self-fulfilling prophecy of like I said, narcissism and just total self-cultivation. There's no sense of participation in a larger goal, participation in social change, improvement of the world, and so on, which to me, music plays a very important role in. And that's why the manufacturing of celebrity, the elevation of fame and gain above the rewards that music actually can provide is such an important thing to combat. Why it's so important that musicians themselves actually rebel against that and hold on to music as an activity. Music is something that is shared. Music that is something that human beings need to be human. It certainly goes back a number of centuries in terms of what the role of the artist actually is. I mean, you could even talk about Plato in the Republic banning the poet, you know, and whether the poet will tell the truth or will the poet tell lies. I mean, so this is a very old dispute between the state or the governing entity and the arts. One of the roles that art can play, and particularly music, is a social critic. That it actually exposes the hypocrisies and the falsehoods of those who claim to be serving the public interest. And the threat that a popular artist can pose, you know, whether it be ridiculing, mocking the authorities, challenging them directly, and demanding on behalf of the populace that they justify their actions. I mean, this is what, you know, the whole romantic movement, the whole idea of the rebel artist, which in my generation was you know, in the 60s was paramount. I mean, the whole idea that music itself was subversive and that music was capable of dethroning emperors. Blue jeans and rock and roll brought down the Berlin Wall, you know, and that kind of idea was a very powerful one even in recent times. I think that more recently, in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a very definite and concerted effort to defang music. Not by banning it, but just the opposite, by making so much of it that the world is saturated with sound, that it's constantly being played everywhere. You're hearing it wherever you turn, whether you want to hear it or not. We're being bombarded with, you know, sonic fast food. It's like, you know, McDonald's or something, but it's in the form of music, in the sense that you hear these things on the you know, the phone while you're waiting for your dentist. You hear them in the supermarket, you hear them at the airport, you hear it everywhere. You're hearing music or muzak. It's programmed, obviously, and it's programmed very scientifically to create certain moods and create certain atmospheres and ambience that whoever is running that particular space considers appropriate. But that is the opposite of prohibition, but it achieves the same effect. You know, it's the opposite of clamping down on something and forbidding somebody from performing or from playing, but it has the exact same effect of defanging, taking the bite out of music that has a social criticism to make. I was just in a class last night where the question of this question of whether or not music could still play a radical role or a critical role in today's politics. And my answer is yes, it certainly can, but that it's not going to be allowed in the sense that it would, you might say that in the 60s it was actually promoted to a certain extent. In other words, you could have a group like Crosby, Stills and Nash who were extremely successful singing a song like Ohio after the Kent State killings, you know, when the National Guard shot 4 students at Kent State, and Crosby, Stills and Nash respond with a song called Ohio that deliberately criticizes Nixon and so on and so forth. Those conditions, the conditions that made that kind of thing possible, don't prevail. You know, at this point, you're going to see a lot more of the sort of narcissism and me, you know, that kind of message coming across, drowning out the others that are still trying to use music as a means of changing the world or enlightening people. It's come to be known as neoliberalism. The market is everything. It originates with Reagan and Thatcher in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. Its origins are actually Friedrich Hayek, who is a German economist, and it was carried on by Milton Friedman and the so-called Chicago Boys, and so on. Its history is rather notorious, as a matter of fact, and a lot of the contemporary uprisings that are taking place in Latin America and Lebanon, in Iraq, are all directed at the effects of that austerity, you know, the corruption that's gone on in all of these societies, often very directly linked to the World Bank and the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and so on, designed to cut social programs, designed to make the people essentially pay for everything, that there are no, there is no such thing as society. That's what Margaret Thatcher notoriously said. There's only families and individuals. And so its inevitable consequences are that the arts suffer, that the only art that is actually supported is what entertains the wealthy, or what the wealthy can use to decorate their luxurious lives, and then as far as what the masses can afford to consume, they'll make that too. But when you think about the consequences in terms of education are fairly obvious, and I mean people everywhere, I mean this is certainly true in Europe as well as North America, have been decrying this. This is one of the reasons that there's such a pushback coming from people like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn in England, or you name it. A lot of politicians on the left are singling out these particular issues because it's so blatant, and the impacts of these cuts have been it's measurable. It's obvious what the effects have been on for a couple of different generations. As far as music is concerned, again, coming back to music education or arts education, this is clearly something that needs to be reintroduced on a massive scale in schools. There is no doubt from all the surveys, all the tests, all the studies that have been done, the benefits that art and education have on children's ability to learn, what they retain, memory enhancement, everything else, regardless of whether they become artists or not. To me, this is just absolutely clear. There's actually very little controversy about that anymore, and yet it doesn't get implemented. In other words, there's always the argument, well, we can't afford it. There's no money left. We don't have any, you're constantly hearing this story about, the lack of funding, which then comes back to the fact that the privatization of everything has defunded the state. So the state has no resources with which to actually fund education and transportation and communications and so on and so forth. So in that broad context, it's music, you might say, well, is it really that important? I mean, people need to eat, and people need to house themselves, and people need to have, some basic means of survival. To what extent is music really relevant? I mean, does it really actually matter what we're talking about now when things are so dire for so many people in the United States? On one level, that's an argument I take very seriously. That I think that musicians need to be cognizant of the fact that a very large number of people in the United States, the so-called richest country on earth, are very poor and are suffering, in tangible and intangible ways that affect their relationship with music and with musicians, whether or not they're going to be able to afford to come to a concert, whether they're going to be able to buy a CD or whatever. All those kinds of things are certainly having impacts on musicians. On the other hand, I think that music, in a certain sense, plays an even greater role in this context. In other words, music of real quality, music that actually can speak to the soul, that can bring forth what is most vital in human life, is even more important in these conditions. In other words, when everything's kind of going along fine, when everything is more or less okay, well, maybe it doesn't make that much of a difference. But I think that at times like this, which are so dire, having music that really speaks truth and evokes honest emotions and real feelings amongst a community of people can have even more impact and be of greater significance than in so-called ordinary times. There is a fundamental conflict between the idea of ownership and the making and sharing of music. Once music is in the world, It's an ephemeral thing. It passes through your sensory apparatus, your ears. It's a joyous disturbance of the air, and that's it. That's what music is. So to try to put this into the framework that you would say a piece of steel or, you know, a fixed object of some kind, really is at odds with the actual object that music is, and it's also at odds with the process by which music is actually made, which itself is a social process. Fundamentally, music is an activity. It's not actually the end result that drives music. It's something that people do. And so to try to turn that into a profit-making device or a commodity that can be bought and sold is quite a logical gymnastic feat in a sense. And it's particularly true of music. Other arts are similar in a sense. Certainly performing arts like dance and theater or whatever, they are things that people do, and they are things that people can do without an industry. But music in particular is so basic. I mean, people being able to sing, people being able to clap their hands or tap their toes or do this with their family and friends is natural. That is very similar to talking, very similar to breathing. And I think that that's where this clash, this friction is constant. When I was going to school many years ago, we used to have music appreciation. That's gone. I went to public school in San Francisco and there were music appreciation courses. Okay, that was not very sophisticated. When I was 8 years old, it was learning very simple, you might call them folk songs or whatever, but it was appreciation of music, and that was just part of the curriculum. So this is a basic lack today. Another dimension of that is that in terms of music venues or in terms of the control of sound, this is one of the major functions of the state. Controlling sound is extremely vital. Who actually broadcasts? Who gets permits to hold concerts in the park? How loud can amplification be? There are laws limiting it to 120 decibels or 90 decibels and so on. Sound is controlled. This is extremely important. At the same time that noise is permitted, and cities are extremely noisy, but music in particular is very controlled and policed, particularly in public spaces, such as parks and public performances of that kind. As far as venues for popular music, whether it's nightclubs or coffee houses or other things, again, there's always permits required. There's always restrictions placed on what you can do. For example, I had some friends in Boston who were attending Berklee College of Music, and they were doing their own house concerts, meaning jazz, in this case, playing jazz music acoustically, and they were raided by the police. Why? Because they weren't paying a tax. It wasn't even a noise ordinance complaint. They weren't even getting complaint from the neighbors because they weren't playing that loud, but they were being raided and charged for not having paid a certain tax, which whatever Boston's laws are, I'm not sure what they are. And of course that would be an interesting case. I don't really know what happened, but whether you have the right to play music in your own house, I mean, this could become a free speech issue, I suppose. But the point, I guess, being that on many different levels, the question of music being performed and how it's delivered, shall we say, to the public or to an assembly, is definitely a question of state legislation and of what society decides it wants to do, what it wants to support, what it wants to fund, what it wants to encourage, what it wants to discourage, and so on. when I've gone to music schools that are devoted to music, pure and simple, Berklee College of Music, for example, but also in Switzerland, I've given talks at a number of jazz schools where they're devoted to training really highly skilled people. When they come out with their degree, it's not just a piece of paper. I mean, these guys can play. You know, they're highly skilled musicians by the time they're trained. Well, one of the most basic questions that comes up with the predictability of the sun rising in the morning is, are there any positions, paying positions, or am I going to have to teach? You know, when you're cranking out quality like that, year after year, year after year, there has to be a certain number of places on stages that are actually going to provide employment for musicians. And that's a serious question. You know, I don't think it's confined to musicians. It probably applies to chemists as well. I know in Switzerland, for example, I have friends who are teachers of chemistry, and they say that in consultation with the chemical industry, which is one of the biggest in Switzerland, the question of how many chemists can be gainfully employed when you're graduating a certain number every year. You know, do you have PhDs at the end of an assembly line quality testing aspirin? I mean, is that what you do with your PhD? The business of education might be booming. There might be more and more applicants. But let's face it, these are demographic facts. You're talking, in 1965, the world population went to 3 billion. 3 billion in 1965, 7 billion in 2000 or whatever, whenever we cross that mark, more than double. So obviously there's going to be an increase in the numbers of people applying for higher education, including musicians. There's going to be a greater demand for those educational opportunities and whatever. And the question is whether or not society can actually supply those needs. And I think that on the one hand, it would make perfect sense from a social point of view. The more people, more interest, more opportunities for teachers, for music, more social demand. But in this society, unless it's going to generate a profit, unless somebody's going to make money from it, then it's not even considered. It's not taken seriously. In fact, education is a serious question. Why are people in the United States in debt $100,000 by the time they get out of 4 years, 5 years of education, whether it's music or not? People going to Berklee College of Music, they're not going to be able to pay themselves back on what they earn as musicians for many years. And you graduate with your diploma, that doesn't guarantee you a job as a musician. You know, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to make that money back. Instrument manufacturers sell dreams. Obviously, people enjoy and you might say actually benefit from having aspirations and hopes and dreams when they want to pick up a guitar or play a piano or learn the trumpet or learn how to play drums or whatever instrument or learn how to sing. I think it may be very naive, but there's nothing wrong with naivete as long as you're aware that you have more to learn. But the problem where it becomes destructive is precisely in the casino or the lottery approach to, quote, making it, whatever making it is supposed to mean. In my experience, the dreams that a young person has when, like let's say they're 9 years old or 10 years old and just dreaming about playing music because are quite innocent and quite healthy. And then they get turned into something else, which is unhealthy, and that is the lottery metaphor of that you're going to win the lottery, and somehow, unlike all of your peers, unlike all the other human beings with whom you share this planet, you're going to somehow rise above and be in some kind of stratosphere of luxury and notoriety. That is a distortion of what a child dreams about when they actually, are inspired to take up an instrument and start playing music. Turning that into this lottery mentality is what fuels the music industry. This is clearly what they depend on. But when it's your life, when it's, as you said, try one more time to make one more effort with a YouTube video or a this or that so I can make it. No. what you need to be making is music. What you need to be making is a life. What you need to be doing is engaging in your craft through your art. You need to develop skills. You have to have discipline. You need to be committed to something that has no quantitative side. It's not measured in terms of dollars and cents. It's not measured in terms of how big your audience is. It's simply the quality of what you're doing, both the act of doing it and the product. And this is something that musicians must, particularly people who aspire to be professional musicians or make it their lives as opposed to a hobby or just something that you do for fun, you must cling to this, you might say, life rope of quality and of craft, and that what you're engaged in is a practice that requires an enormous amount of discipline and commitment. Otherwise, you're not going to get the results. The rise of the labor movement, unionization, tremendous upheaval in society, particularly after the Great Depression, encouraged a very large number of musicians, particularly musicians in the classical field, the orchestras in film, as well as popular musicians such as jazz artists and whatnot, to unionize. And the American Federation of Musicians set up work rules for rates of pay, standards of hours, and so on and so forth, that corresponded to a certain extent with what, say, an auto worker would demand or expect with a union contract in a workplace. And so there was certainly, when I was young, when I was just becoming a musician myself, there was still a musicians union. You had to join if you wanted to play publicly. Anyone who wanted to play in a nightclub in San Francisco had to join the union. And certainly anybody who was signed to a record deal or worked for a Hollywood film company, studio or whatever, all these people were unionized. And the attitude of my elders, people that I looked up to when I was learning to play guitar, people at that time who were 40, 50 years old and had grown up, perhaps born in the 30s and so on, their attitude was, you got to get paid. If the union says these are the rules, these are the rules. You know what I mean? We have to stick together. There was that kind of labor attitude. But by the time I came around, I was 16 in 1967, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, all the San Francisco groups that went on to becoming, a world famous Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, Big Brother and the Holding Company, all these groups were coming out and influencing people like me, because this is where I grew up in San Francisco. And their attitude of being artists and, you might say world changers, wanting to change the world in some perhaps very vague and nebulous way, but nevertheless, there was this attitude of we're bringing about a new age. We're going to, change everything through music, through dance, through the arts. And that romantic notion, and it really was a romantic notion, that the artist was going to be the bearer of truth, and the artist was going to be the one who led, the Pied Piper of Hamelin was going to lead the children out of the clutches of the evil and lying state. This had a tremendous influence because, first of all, there was some truth to that. Music was having this kind of subversive and disruptive effect, particularly amongst young people. In that context, it was possible to, you might say, encourage this notion that we're not workers. We're not laboring people. What we do is art. What we do is something else. And what's false about that, and what I think, I certainly came to view differently, was that actually this worked, in two ways. On the one hand, there was a positive side to it, no doubt. But on the other hand, there was a side to it that made the collective interests of musicians suffer. In other words, what we share and what we could actually benefit from by banding together and supporting one another was out the window. The idea of joining a union now is, forget it. It's a completely dead issue. The American Federation of Musicians does still exist, and if you want to work in Hollywood or, in orchestras and whatnot, you have to join the union. But broadly speaking, the union is a shadow of what it once was, and I don't think most musicians aspire to that kind of collective action. The absurdity of paying to play, this notion that started out in the 80s in San Francisco and Los Angeles, that you somehow had to pay a venue operator in order to grace their stage with your presence and or sell tickets or whatever else. In other words, this notion that the musician had to make it worth somebody else's while in order to actually have an opportunity to play this is the exact opposite of we have a service we're offering. We are skilled workers who bring something that we should be compensated for. This kind of thing, I don't even know to what extent that's still going on. I know that it kind of flopped in San Francisco. I don't live here now, so it's been a long time. But I know I saw that going on when I was still here, this whole pay-to-play thing, which I found completely ridiculous and unacceptable. Let's say post-60s, certainly by the 90s, this question of gentrification, and particularly in big cities like San Francisco and New York, which had been, you might say, the basis for lots of art scenes of many different kinds, not only music, but London as well. And all these places became so expensive, real estate speculation, asset grabs, and so on and so forth, that obviously the net result over the course of 30 years is to drive out all the artists. That they can't afford to pay the rent, so they have to move elsewhere. And that clearly takes its toll. They're replaced to a large extent by either people working on Wall Street or stockbrokers or people working for high-tech firms like Google and Facebook. This is the case in San Francisco, who can afford to pay $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a month for a one-bedroom apartment. Crazy rents. And it skews everything. So I don't think I really have to comment on that because it's so widely known. I think the larger question, or where music itself is affected, or where you might say the intersection between larger societal malaise that are affecting everybody and music, and how music is being affected or musicians are being affected, is that I think that the ways that people can resist, or the ways that people can actually go on making music, will become more and more reliant on cooperative efforts. Like I said, doing house concerts, doing things that are small scale, doing things that are actually supported by communities that support that particular artist or that particular kind of music. They're going to be a lot lower key in the sense of publicity and notoriety, but they can be ultimately very rewarding, and people should not give up on the idea of performing music, making music, recording music, whatever you want to say, even when it's on a smaller scale. Of course, you're going to have to struggle to find funding. You're going to have to find ways to pay for what you're doing. This is an ongoing problem. There's no doubt that people are going to have to find particular solutions in each city, in each particular locale. There are going to be different conditions. I can't tell somebody in St. Louis what they have to do, or what in San Diego what they may have to do. But I do know that the idea of autonomous effort, using music to gather people, has real potential, and people should not just assume that, well, if I can't get a gig at a an above ground normal venue, then I'm done for. That's not true. And in fact, it may be that the collapse of the conventional music industry, or whatever people are talking about, nowadays, is actually a blessing in disguise, at least from the standpoint of what music can actually offer and the opportunities that people who are dedicated to actually making music can create for themselves. It has to be fundamentally understood that music plays a social role, that it is actually a vital component and it needs to be supported. That means musicians need to be supported, music educators need to be supported, and the taxpayer has to do that. That it's not the market that determines what is good music or what is valuable music or what is necessary and beneficial to the community, but it's actually the community itself that decides and should have the funds and the resources to compensate musicians to bring forward new music education programs and so on and so forth. In other words, it comes from the public back to the public. Keep music alive and maintain your principles, maintain the standards of quality that guide you. Those should be your guides, and fundamentally, it's about sharing.